Okay, guys, in this section, we're going to take a look at the collapse of Reconstruction. Um, just a few things here. There's a lot of reasons why Reconstruction collapsed. Okay, now remember, presidential Reconstruction, they were just looking to bring those southern states back into the Union. But when we talk about Congressional Reconstruction, they were talking about, more rights for African Americans and so on. So when we talk about the collapse of Reconstruction, we're now talking about the collapse of Congressional Reconstruction. Okay, so the KKK and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, that had an effect on the civil rights of blacks in the South and their ability to exercise their civil rights. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of violence towards blacks during that time period. There was also a lot of economic pressure at that time. People were more interested in the economy succeeding than they were in securing black rights. Here, let me just delete this real quick. There we go. Sorry about that. So there was a lot of economic pressure. There were some shifts in political power. Confederates started to gain, former Confederates, I should say, started to gain power in the South as well. And then there were scandals in the Grant administration, and that really hurt the Reconstruction process as people looked to push those people associated with the scandals out of office. So, and for that reason, a lot of the support for Reconstruction kind of faded. Okay, so let's go through Section 3 real quickly here. First of all, let's start with the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK, obviously a terrorist group. A lot of you guys know about them. You've heard of them before, but they grew very rapidly once Republicans began to get control in the South. And of course, their goal was white supremacy. One of the tactics that they used was violence against people. They lynched blacks. They threatened violence against them. They murdered them. They used intimidation to prevent them from voting. They destroyed schools, churches, homes, and all kinds of different things to just prevent blacks from exercising their civil rights. So the Klan works to force the Republican state governments out of power. That was basically their goal. They wanted Southern Democrats in power. So it wasn't like the KKK was running for office. This was a terrorist group who wanted to restore the Southern Democrats into power. Okay, and as a result, as you see here, there were a lot of white Democratic candidates who won elections, state elections in 1875, 1876. So it took about 10 years from about 67 or so to about 77. During that 10-year period, you had a lot of Republicans in power. But by 1877, Democrats were back in. Okay, economic pressure. Black landowners, non-farmers, obviously they were attacked. They would have their property destroyed by the KKK as well. So they didn't want blacks to succeed. Also, the need forces freemen into wage labor, sharecropping for whites. So there was some economic pressure to not have blacks succeed. Whites, obviously, prior to the Civil War, they were dependent upon slavery for their financial success. And then here again, they're looking for whatever way they can to keep blacks poor, and therefore they profit off of their labor. So again, you're seeing that take place. Legislative response. Well, Grant did have some anti-Klan bills called the Enforcement Acts. What they did was basically it allowed them to jail Klan members and things like that. It was a federal crime. So it did have some impact, but the Supreme Court ruled that some of it was unconstitutional. And then eventually they would, people who opposed the Enforcement Acts, they said, well, look, violence in the South is decreasing. There's no need for these laws. Well, the real reason why the violence was decreasing was because Democrats were actually restoring control. They didn't need to use violence anymore. They were already in positions of power by that time. So, 1872 Amnesty Act returned the voting rights to many former Confederates, and when they did, these Confederates exercised that right to vote. They voted for Democrats. Immediately you start to see a change. You see here the Freedmen's Bureau, they were going to let that expire. So many of the programs that Reconstruction started with are now being taken away as you start to see more and more Southern Democrats and in many cases former Confederates begin to take office. One of the big things that hurt Republicans was the scandals associated with the Grant administration. Grant was considered to be a pretty honest person, but he appointed some guys who were not so honest. And beginning in 1872, there were some scandals which were exposed. One example was one of his buddies was accepting a bribe on a whiskey tax. There were some other obviously there were some other scandals as well, but it just really was a black eye because it wasn't one or two individuals. It was more like 3 or 4 individuals that were close to Grant who were involved in this. As a result, many Republicans were not happy with their own party, and in 1872 a liberal Republican Party formed. Now, while it says liberal, this group was a little bit more like the Democrats than, say, the radical Republicans, who were way extreme. So these guys were more middle of the road. I know today we say liberal Republicans or liberal Democrats, and they tend to be very left or very extreme. But in this case, these people were more middle of the road. So the liberal Republican Party formed. They nominated Horace Greeley, and the Democrats also nominated Horace Greeley. Nonetheless, though, Grant won. He won by a pretty wide margin in the 1872 presidential election. But what it does show is that the Republicans are weakened, that there is an arm of their party that's not very happy. And so you start to see a move towards the center, and that weakens the radicals. Okay, those are the people who supported Reconstruction. This group here, they are very much weakened by it. Okay, by this split. So that makes Reconstruction kind of difficult. Again, as I pointed out, there was more corruption in the Grant administration. So after 2 terms, he does not seek re-election. And then you have the Panic of 1873. There's a lot of economic turmoil. So here, there were business opportunities in the South that led investors to excessive debt. For example, they wanted to build railroads and things like that. So there were a lot of people who invested heavily into the railroads. Banks gave out loans to railroads. States gave out loans to railroads. There's a lot of debt. And then when it came time to pay on that debt, people couldn't. Banks closed. States were out of money. It just wasn't a very good situation. So the railroads themselves, in some cases, went out of business. Eventually, the stock market collapsed, and it triggered a kind of a 5-year economic depression. So, in many ways, kind of similar to what happened in 2008, where you had the bubble in the housing industry burst, and then banks lost money and unemployment went up. Kind of the same thing here, except for the bubble was centered kind of around railroads. So, but anyways, it triggered a 5-year economic depression. Unemployment was very high during that time. And usually during hard economic times, people look to the other political party. They want to make a political change. So things are not looking good for the Republicans right here with the scandals and then the economic, the Panic of 1873. In the midst of this, there was a currency dispute. The Panic of 1873 fueled a dispute over currency. See, it used to be that every dollar that the United States made was backed up by gold. Then they went to the greenback system, and greenbacks was just backed up with a promise that it was worth the value of $1. And a lot of people wanted to bring the country back to that gold standard, at least in the Northeast. Okay, these are business owners and so on. The reason why they didn't want the government to produce a lot of money. Okay, with inflation, okay, if you had $1,000 loan and then there's rapid inflation, in other words, you put a lot more money out there, that $1,000 loan doesn't have, that you're holding, that someone owes you, doesn't have a lot of value over time with rapid inflation. So they really wanted to cut back on inflation, and the way to do that was to return to the gold standard. So those Northeasterners kind of won. The Southerners and the people out west who supported the greenback idea, they lost out. So we did go back to the gold standard for a while. All right, other things that whittled away Reconstruction. Certainly the Supreme Court did. Over time, they started to narrow the interpretations of the 14th and 15th Amendments. For example, the 15th Amendment guarantees your right to vote, says you cannot discriminate based upon race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But as we pointed out in class, it doesn't say anything about your ability to read or your ability to interpret the Constitution or pay a poll tax. So you kind of narrow the scope of these things, and really what it does is it kind of chips away at the civil rights of blacks. The federal government begins to lose power to protect African American rights, and as they lose that power, certainly the southern states are not going to obviously protect their rights either. So once again, black civil rights are kind of slowly going away. Northern support fades. As rights are going away, so does the support for Northerners to kind of continue this fight. They begin to grow indifferent. In other words, they think that other issues are becoming more important, specifically the economic crisis. So they begin to shift their attention to more national problems. They do want a reconciliation between the two regions. Many people are tired of the split, and they're looking for ways that they can move forward. So they begin to dislike a lot of these Reconstruction policies. Now, Republicans kind of give up from a lack of judicial public support and also a lack of leaders. By this time, Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner had passed away. So there's just not someone to kind of carry that torch and keep pushing on for the fight of black civil rights. Republicans also conclude that government cannot impose moral or social changes. They can change the law, but they're not going to change the values of those people in the South. So they kind of feel like they're doing an uphill battle here, and for that reason maybe they should just stop pushing it moving forward. Needless to say, the Democrats did recapture the South, and redemption is the return to Democrats to power, and that kind of occurred between 1869 and 1875. It was at that time that many Democrats, there's the church bells, many of the Democrats won state offices, local offices, and towards the end, towards the 1875, they even start to win federal offices. So, and then the all-important election of 1876. If we look at what was the end of Reconstruction, for the most part, we point to the election of 1876 and what came out of that, which was the Compromise of 1877. The Republican nominee for president was Rutherford B. Hayes, not Grant. Remember, Grant chose not to rerun. And the Democrats chose Samuel Tilden. Now, Tilden won the popular vote, but he was one shy of the Electoral College vote, which is really what elects you to be president. Now, there were 20 electoral votes that were disputed, and all 20 would end up going to Rutherford B. Hayes. So he ended up winning the election. There was a group, a commission that was created, majority of them Republicans, and they decided to give the election to Hayes. In return, the Democrats were able to get federal troops to leave Louisiana and South Carolina, and they also got funding for the Southern Railroad and waterways. Obviously, they were looking for investment in the infrastructure in the South. And the other thing they asked was that a conservative Southerner be added to the cabinet, kind of as a check to Hayes. And so they did agree with that too. And really what this compromise signals is the means, or what it means is the end of Reconstruction. At this point, Republicans are no longer going to protect black civil rights with military troops, and you see this when the troops leaving. They also are shifting now to more economic purposes. So that's really what you see here. They just kind of feel like they've done everything they could. So what you're left with is home rule in the South. After they remove the troops, Democrats take over. They're running the state government. They're running local governments. There's no federal intervention, and really what this means is blacks, for the most part, lose their civil rights in the South, and they wouldn't be returned until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and even into the 1970s. So in the end, what is the legacy of Reconstruction? Well, it just kind of depends on who you ask. Some people say it was very successful. Some people say it was very unsuccessful. Most people are somewhere in between. Republicans did fail to protect the rights that they gave to the former slaves. Yes, they were citizens. Yes, they ended slavery. Yes, they had the right to vote. But could they actually exercise that right? And clearly by 1877, the answer was no. There was an unwillingness to distribute land blocks, that blocks their economic independence. So for many blacks, they felt that the way to freedom was actually through economic means, and they didn't have that because they didn't own land and could not own land. Amendments to abolish slavery did give the basis for the civil rights legislation and so on. Those clearly were successful. There were many African American schools, civic groups, church groups, that kind of thing that were created during this time period. And obviously, as we talk about the civil rights of the 1960s, those schools and churches and things were instrumental into them finally achieving equality. All right, that's the end. Good luck on your test tomorrow.